Okay, well, let's get rolling. I'm Shauna McKinnon, and I'm hosting the session today as one of the coordinators for the BC Living Lab with the Investment Agriculture Foundation. And we have 100 participants now joining us this morning live, which is really exciting. I know that there's been a lot of interest in this project, and it's been a lot of work in behind the scenes to get the project up and running. And I know people are wanting to hear more details, so we're really excited to finally have a chance to share more details about the project and to have our industry partners presenting today. I'm joining from Vancouver on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. And as I mentioned before, I'm hosting the session today as one of the coordinators for the BC Living Lab with the Investment Agriculture Foundation. So throughout our 2 hours today, you'll have a chance to hear from a number of the partners in the BC Living Lab, and there are a lot of partners involved in this project. To begin our session today, Abby Morris, who's the Director of Programs at the Investment Agriculture Foundation, is going to begin with an introduction to the structure and the partners involved in the program. And the Investment Agriculture Foundation is leading this program. Then Kristen Hannum, who is one of the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada science leads who are supporting both of the living labs in BC, will be explaining the approach to research and collaboration. And then you'll have a chance to hear from each of the industry leads from the commodity groupings. And they're going to be sharing details about the beneficial management practices that will be trialed in the project and what the growers are most interested in learning. We will have a break for Q&A after each of these presenters, and you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom control panel to type in your questions. Because we have so many people presenting, it would be great if you could remember to write down the name of the person who you're directing the question to. And then that way, if we run out of time for the Q&A, the speaker could always follow up and type in an answer for you. You're also most welcome to use the chat to introduce yourself and to share comments. I can see now we have 119 people joining us live. So yeah, feel free to say hello, and if you want to let us know where you're joining from, and if you have want to share what your interest is in the Living Lab, that would be great. Last thing is that the session is being recorded today, so we will be sharing this publicly afterwards as an introduction to the BC Living Lab and to the partnerships and objectives. So now I'm going to pass things over to Abby Morris, who is the Director of Programs for IAF, and she's going to begin today's presentation.
Thanks so much, Shauna, for the introduction. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see so many live participants here today, and I'll be with you for the first few slides just to walk through the overall structure of the BC Living Lab. So the Living Lab Network is one of 9 living labs across the country, funded by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada under the new Agricultural Climate Solutions Programme. IAF has been the leading of this multi-commodity project, bringing together diverse production systems under one Living Lab programme. The objective of the programme is obviously to help BC farmers contribute to climate change mitigation while improving the productivity and ecological benefits of farmland for future generations. The structure of the programme, as you can see, is slightly complex, given that we're with multiple commodities. So the multiple commodity programme that's taking place across multiple regions in BC, and the BC Living Lab has many partners. IAF has the contribution agreement with AAFC Programs Branch as the BC Living Lab Programme lead. Then the AAFC Science and Technology Branch research stations in both Agassiz and Summerland are actively working on the BC Living Lab as well. IAF is administering agreements with multiple industry partners that represent the 5 commodity groups that make up the Living Lab. And that includes the perennial row crops, berries and hazelnuts in the Lower Mainland, perennial row crops with wine grapes and tree fruit in the Okanagan, field vegetables, cattle and forage, and dairy. A number of the producer partners are also working with university researchers to support their projects. In terms of industry partners, we have 9 different production types and covering geographies all the way from Highway 16 in the Cariboo through to Thompson, Nicola, Okanagan, Fraser Valley and Vancouver Island. Pretty diverse. The BC Living Lab is creating an opportunity for collaboration, relationship building, and coordinated research among the industry partners, as well as with researchers. In terms of governance, to bring all these partners together, we've established a governance structure for the Living Lab to provide leadership and guidance to the whole program. The role of the BC Living Lab Steering Committee is to oversee and monitor the program's progress, identify areas for cross-commodity collaboration, and ensure Living Lab principles are adhered to. It also serves as a venue for project leads to seek decisions on key issues as they arise. The voting members of the steering committee are the industry partners, which represent producers' interests. Non-voting members include program partners and the BC Ministry of Agriculture, who are also interested in aligning with the BC Living Lab activities. On that note, I will pass you over to Kirsten from AAFC for further information.
Thank you, Abby. My name is Kirsten Hannum, and I'm a research scientist at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Summerland Research and Development Centre. And as Abby mentioned, I'm serving as AAFC's science team co-lead on the BC Living Lab, along with my friend and colleague Shabtai Bittman, who is a research scientist based at the Agassiz Research and Development Centre. I've been asked to provide a bit of background on the Agricultural Climate Solutions Living Labs program approach to research and collaboration. So there are three main priority activities under the Agricultural Climate Solutions Living Lab. These are, number one, deployment, evaluation, and refinement of management practices that can increase soil carbon and decrease greenhouse gas emissions, while at the same time, promoting other co-benefits that are of particular interest to farmers. These co-benefits might include all kinds of things like improved soil health and water quality, increased biodiversity, reduced production costs, and improved crop quality and yield. Second, the ACS Living Labs program includes evaluation of the social and economic costs and benefits of adopting these practices. So this work is really important because it will help us identify and address barriers to the adoption of practices that might be deployed to promote climate change mitigation. And third is the widespread and frequent knowledge exchange activities, not only for participating farmers, but also for the wider farming community. And this knowledge exchange work is really important to help ensure that farmers are aware of practices that can be deployed to support climate change mitigation, and also can be fully informed about the potential costs and benefits and the practicalities of their implementation. So these three activities are meant to work hand in hand to promote the adoption of effective climate change mitigation practices across the agricultural sector in BC. So at the same time, it's very important that three key principles of Living Labs drive all of the activities I listed on the earlier slide. First, any innovations that are evaluated in the Living Lab need to be user-centered or farmer-centered. This means scientists don't necessarily design or identify the practices to be considered under the Living Labs. Instead, farmers select the practices that will be evaluated. Farmers are heavily involved in the evaluation of the practices, and farmers work closely with scientists to refine the practices through time. Second, because farmers and scientists are meant to work together on co-developing, evaluating, and sharing information about practices that are being evaluated, it's really critical that they work in close partnership. And finally, all practices need to be evaluated on farm in a manner that reflects real life. This means Living Lab projects look very different on the ground to the kinds of field trials that many of us scientists are used to. Instead, they're likely to be applied over large areas using real farm practices and equipment. This ensures that the economic costs of a given agricultural practice can be appropriately evaluated. As well, management practices won't necessarily be applied the same way every year because farmers will continually adapt and evolve the practices based on what they see the previous year. And last slide for me. So this is what we mean when we talk about the iterative cycle of improvement in a living lab context. Farming practices are allowed to change and evolve over time in an adaptive learning kind of model. So with that, I'll turn it over to the commodity leads to talk about the individual components of the BC Living Lab and how they're going to fit together. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kirsten. Before we get there, I'm just gonna pick up a little bit on a couple of the points that you're making around the iterative nature of the Living Lab approach. And I just wanted to highlight that in the BC Living Lab, the BMPs that are being trialed began with producer engagement. And that was led by each of the industry partners. And then now plans are being developed for field trials that will be evaluating these BMPs, and those will be going into place beginning this spring. And it's really on those farmer partner field trials where the evaluation of the performance of these BMPs is taking place. And then that feeds into the knowledge exchange process and the further refinement of the BMPs over the 4 years of the program, which again involves producer engagement. So this program is really about this cycle of engagement and trials, evaluating and continuing to learn together and tweak the practices. A couple of other components of the BC Living Lab. One, most of the living labs in the country are commodity specific, and this one is maybe the only one that's multi-commodity, definitely the only one with this many commodities coming together. So there is this opportunity in the BC Living Lab to do cross-commodity comparison and to be trying things and evaluating things in the same way across different regions and in different commodity production systems. There's also a landscape level analysis that will take place later in the project. In the later years. So not just looking at the farm level impacts, but scaling up. And then lastly, there's the socioeconomic factor, which Kirsten touched on, but really looking at what affects adoption and how to encourage adoption. So before we get into the industry leads presentations, I wanted to also just give you this sort of zoomed out view of what the BC Living Lab is looking like. And this map gives you just a sense of the different commodities that are involved and where the field trials will be taking place. And the network of farms that will be part of the BC Living Lab. So I wanted to, while people are listening in today and hearing about what's taking place in the BC Living Lab, there's a lot going on in this project, but of course it's never going to answer all the questions. So I think one way of thinking about the Living Lab is a structure to build on. So there's definitely more opportunities for partnerships to evolve that can be integrated into the Living Lab, or to have further research engagement, looking at other types of evaluation around the BMPs. So there's a lot of opportunities in terms of research engagement, new partnerships, and also being involved in the knowledge transfer components of the project. So with that, we're going to take a pause here for questions, and I already see that there's at least one question in the Q&A. So let me start there. So I think I'm going to pass this one actually to Kirsten from ASC. And the question is around how the structure and participation of the BC Living Lab connects with the research and development needs in the Peace region producers and the Peace Living Lab, which covers both the BC piece and the Alberta piece.
Thanks, Shauna, and thanks, Reg, for the question. It's a really great one, and we are lucky in BC to have these two living labs. Shabtai Bittman and I are actually AAFC co-leads on both of these living labs. So now that we have the structure in place for both the Peace region and the BC Living Labs, we're working on developing those connections. I can say that as well, there are AAFC research scientists with particular expertise, both in BC and Alberta, that have been engaged on both the Peace region and BC Living Labs. And so we're going to be building those connections and common metrics and as we go. So there are already a lot of BMPs that are of interest in both living labs, such as livestock integration and cover cropping that cross both BC Living Labs. So I think there's going to be a lot of data compatibility and commonalities in research questions and approaches.
Great, thank you for that. Also, I just wanted to note that there was some challenges with the chat earlier, and it's now been enabled. So you can use that now. And we do have another question in the Q&A around the Cherry Association involvement. I'm going to pause on that one because I know that Gail Nelson from the BC Fruit Growers is going to touch on that in her presentation when we get there. So if there are, let's see, are there any other questions? Okay. Yes, so one last question. Are there opportunities to expand the geographic coverage of commodity groups? So for example, with forage, which is the most widely produced crop in BC. Yes, excellent question. I would say there are opportunities to expand the project, and that's something that we hope to see in the later years of the project. So as I said, you know, the initial set of field trials are the base set, and then it's a structure to build on in later years. And you know, especially if you have an interest in forage, when we get to the forage section of the presentation, you can ask some specific questions around that. But yeah, that's definitely something that we'd hope to see over the years of the project, to be adding more producer collaborators and more involvement from other regions. So I think with that, I'm now going to pass things here in a second to Emma. So just give me a moment here. Great, so I'd like to introduce Emma Streznik from the BC Dairy Association. And yeah, Emma.
Hi everyone. I am Emma. I'm staff with BC Dairy, and I guess I'll just kick it off. Normally, I guess under partners, you'd see a list of one or a few academic institutions. BC Dairy is actually partnering most closely with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, specifically Shabtai Bittman and Derek Hunt, because of their expertise in dairy systems and specifically corn and forages. I think in the future there will be opportunities for greater partnerships with universities. I can imagine particular partnerships maybe with the University of the Fraser Valley and some of their classes, and taking soil samples and pest management for co-benefits. But at this point, it's just us and AFC, and we're really grateful for all the support of Shabtai, Derek, and Kirsten, and as well as Gary Telford. We are targeting primarily the Fraser Valley, and that's out of just sheer practicality for our budget. We're close to the Agassiz Research Center, but we definitely have some producers in the North Okanagan and Vancouver Island who are very interested in participating. So whether or not they come on board year one, which is really a short year for us, or in future years, we're hoping to be able to capture multiple regions and the different co-benefits and barriers to adoption for those different regions. Late in 2021, we did a producer consultation to narrow down the BMPs that would be a priority for dairy farmers when looking at decreasing their greenhouse gas emissions and increasing their soil carbon sequestration. And what came out of that was really a need to look at and facilitate adoption of lower emissions manure spreading methodologies. So typically, most producers, the conventional way of spreading is just a broadcasting at a pretty high trajectory. The other one that emerged was intercropping or some kind of relay cropping, any type of cover cropping really, but we know that many producers are already doing a winter cover. So we wanted to maybe expand that out into a more specific type of cropping that maybe they don't have the equipment to do or don't have the experience to, or haven't taken the risk to try. And then to facilitate both of those things, a full farm and field nitrogen budgeting. And that's really, I would say the lower emissions manure spreading is going to be the most impactful one when we pair this tool with it, because they're able to capture more nitrogen with their manure. They're going to have to purchase fewer inputs. in terms of synthetic fertilizer. Next slide, Shauna. Thank you. So I guess I just kind of went into it, but for the lower emissions manure spreading, the potential to reduce the nitrous oxide emissions is there for any method that is not broadcasting. And we would capture that data in the full farm nitrogen budgeting. We would be identifying participants with manure injectors, dribble bars, or methods of surface banding, and hoping that we can share between sites, between neighbors, and even helping someone to retrofit. I know I've heard stories of someone retrofitting a seed driller to be a manure injector. So anything we can do to facilitate a different method of spreading that someone wants to try is really eligible under this. And then for the intercropping or relay cropping, the varieties are, we're not specifying anything that producers want to try, whether it's a tillage radish to break up soil compaction, or they want to try interseeding a grass into their corn. There are no real limitations, and we suspect that it'll differ by region greatly. So we know that, like I said, many producers grow winter cover, but we want to encourage more people to expand into interseeding into their corn, because that's something that almost all producers do. Next slide. So our research questions are really going to focus around the economics of these practices through this the cost benefit analysis, as well as the socioeconomic questionnaire. We're going to be doing a forage analysis for quality and yield of whatever cover crops are grown, in addition to all the crops grown on the fields that have the different methods of manure spreading, as well as the cover crops. We're going to have AAFC using GasNet technology to measure nitrous oxide emissions on a couple of what we're calling focus farms, as well as changes in soil carbon through regular soil sampling post-harvest and pre-side dress, and those deep core soil samples in year 1 and year 5. And then we'll look at soil health and other co-benefits to the land, and that could be where other universities come in to support on those different co-benefits where we don't have the expertise right now. For year 1, which ends March 31st, we're just hoping to establish 4 to 5 research sites with producer collaborators, and then additional sites would be established in later years. For our knowledge transfer and extension plans, our plan is to put out an information sheet on each of the BMPs. And my vision for that is kind of to expand upon them annually to share producer experiences and how the project is pivoting to meet or address producer barriers. And then as always, we would have field days on trial sites each year and hopefully host some additional virtual seminars. I think that's it for dairy. I'm happy for any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma, for giving that overview. Yeah, so if you have questions for Emma specific to dairy, please type them in the chat. I see there are, yeah, nothing dairy specific so far. So, yes, okay, this is dairy specific. So there's a question here around methane emissions, and if there's any interest in addressing methane emissions. Maybe I'll just field this one quickly, but if any of the AFC folks on the webinar today would like to jump in, feel free. But just in terms of the agricultural climate solutions, the way that the program was first developed, the focus has been on soil organic carbon sequestration, and nitrous oxide emissions has been a focus in terms of GHG emissions, but methane has not yet been a focus of this particular program. I know there's other work that's going on. And Emma, I don't know if you want to mention anything in the dairy sector. I know you guys also have several projects that are focused on methane.
Yeah, we don't have, like, BC Dairy isn't participating in anything directly methane related, but we certainly know of several projects ongoing and have our eyes on that. But yeah, for this project, the focus is nitrogen and not methane. So we don't have the capacity to take on anything specific to, we're not feeding seaweed in this project. we can't quite take that on, but we definitely know it's out there and we're interested to learn more.
Great. So one last question for you, Emma. Have you already picked the 4 to 5 primary sites, and how do you go about picking these sites?
We have not formalized anything yet. We've just put out a notice to producers, and basically we're collecting information to assess eligibility. I think the 4 to 5 sites that we want to really get rolling in the next few months will likely be in the Fraser Valley, just out of sheer convenience because of the time we have. But that's to say year 1 ends March 31st and year 2 starts April 1st. So we're going to try to take on as many as we can. And it really just comes down to where they are, what experiences they have with the BMPs and what they want to try. And if there's equipment nearby or they have it to facilitate that. So we're starting out with some conversations, and BC Dairy is working with Jeff Hughes Games as our project manager on this, who will be having those initial conversations with people. So at this point, the eligibility is wide open, and we've got a few people interested. So if you are interested, send me an email. I can put my email in the chat right now.
Yeah, that'd be great, Emma, if you could put your email in the chat. And now I'm going to pass things over. There is a question in the chat around pasture or grazing. So that is a perfect segue to our next industry grouping. So Serena Black is joining us today from the BC Forage Council, and we have Amanda Miller from the BC Cattlemen's Association, and they are working together on this project. So Amanda or Serena, you can go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Shauna. So the BC Forage Council and the BC Cattlemen's Association have partnered together on the Cattle and Forage project because, of course, there's a huge amount of overlap between these two organizations, or between these two commodity areas. And we've partnered with an excellent research team with the University of Northern British Columbia, Dr. Michael Preston and Dr. Teresa Adesanya, as well as with Thompson Rivers University with Dr. Locke Fraser to help facilitate the research components of this project. And so the regions that we're looking at, we want to have our more detailed projects associated with those universities. And so they will be located in the Highway 16 corridor near Prince George at the University of Northern British Columbia, as well as in the Thompson-Nicola region close to Thompson Rivers University. But because there's such a diversity in the soils, the climate, and the growing season across the province, there's a big desire to expand this into different regions. And so once we move past and through the establishment of this project, we're going to extend some satellite research sites into other regions, including the Cariboo-Chilcotin, Okanagan, the East Kootenays, the Boundary region, etc. All of the major sort of forage and cattle producing regions of the province. So what are we looking at within this project? We're looking at extended grazing season and winter feeding strategies. This has been determined as sort of the biggest economic pinch point and one of the harder components of the industry to address. And so it's the area that we really need some additional research in, especially with regards to how diverse our climate and soils are across the province and the variation that there can be within regions. And we can move to the next slide, Shauna. So our extended grazing beneficial management practices include annual and/or alternative forage crops for fall and winter grazing. And so this includes seeding annual or alternative forage crops or cover crops to extend our fall grazing potential. And a specific area of interest is the use of cover crops for fall grazing, or cover crops planted as a relay crop. Also, we're looking at standing crop for winter grazing. This is where we're sowing annual crops, which is held as a fodder bank for grazing later in the year. And incorporating this winter feeding strategy is hopefully going to assist with reducing crop harvesting emissions and emissions associated with processing and storage. Fall cover crops are another beneficial management practice where seeding winter varieties of annual cereal crops or other crops can provide additional windows for fall or spring grazing for producers, along with the possibility of a crop to be harvested as green feed or silage. And then bale grazing, of course, is a winter feeding strategy, allowing cattle to graze bales in the field, either by harvesting field and leaving it there, or by moving bales harvested in other fields into a field for winter grazing strategies. So that's what we're looking at, researching within the context of this project. And our research questions are, one key area of interest is the economics of these extended grazing practices. So we want to see how they impact sort of that economic bottom line on a unit cost of production basis to try to address that barrier of adoption, because if it doesn't make sense economically for producers to incorporate them, then there may not necessarily be a lot of incentive to have these BMPs adopted within the wider community. We're also looking at changes in soil organic carbon, because these are done on a more intensive basis. There's likelihood that we will have some changes in soil organic carbon, and we want to measure and be able to communicate those changes. And then also soil health and other co-benefits. So we're looking at potential changes to the soils. And then other co-benefits include things such as pollinator diversity, biodiversity within the crops, and various other metrics that our excellent research team will be able to investigate. So we can move to the next slide, Shauna. So our research plans, which I hit on briefly, is we want to have those 2 primary research sites established in 2023. One near Prince George in collaboration with UNBC, one near Kamloops in collaboration with HearU, and of course our farmer partners. And each of these sites will trial all 4 of the best beneficial management practices that we outlined. And then as we move forward throughout the years of this project, we will be looking to establish additional sites with collaborators that on those smaller satellite sites, we'll look at trialing 1 to 2 BMPs in later years, just so it's not quite as burdensome, because they won't have as many research supports in the satellite sites. Our knowledge transfer and extension plans, we are developing a BMP guide that will be applicable across different regions to assist with, again, how to adopt these practices. We will be hosting annual workshops as a component of this project, with field days and demonstrations, as well as on trial sites, in addition to those large annual workshops. We're also going to be establishing a communications hub that will have presentations and technical bulletins and other pieces of extension housed on them, so that we're able to communicate and have a repository for all of this good work that our research team and our farm partners will be undertaking. So I think that's sort of the high level. And Serena, please feel free to jump in if I've missed anything.
No, I just might preemptively answer the question that came in from Reg.
Yep.
So any plans to research on nitrogen management benefits from the more intensive rotational grazing systems? I think one thing to note is that these 4 BMPs might be a part of a rotational grazing system, but not specifically going to be involved with those more intensive advanced grazing systems. But on the other hand, yes, we are actually very interested on the nitrogen management benefits and potential risks of these practices if performed inappropriately. We are lucky that part of our research team is specialized in the nitrogen piece. So the biggest we're still finalizing all the specifics of everything that's going to be measured and how everything's going to be worked out. And we'll have those plans kind of ready in the next month or so here. But the biggest limitation, as I think Emma has already mentioned, is going to be financial limitations, including the number of additional producer sites we're able to incorporate will be limited just based on our funding. So we are actively looking for additional funds, additional regional funds, where we would permit us to have the funding to incorporate additional sites. So having a bit of a delay of installing those additional sites to next year will provide us just a little bit more breathing room to secure additional resources to be able to be more inclusive. So yeah, happy to do that. And I already added our email to the chat for anybody who wants to follow up as well. But thank you, Amanda.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you both, Amanda and Serena. Thanks, Serena, for preemptively answering that question and already putting your contact information there. Are there other questions for Catalin Forge before we move on to our next part of the presentation? Okay, well, if there's other questions that come up, feel free to pop them in the Q&A and just write their names there. Okay, great. Well, I think this could be a cattle and forage focus question. Will the BMP support the adoption of remote sensing technology to capture data on the farm?
We haven't necessarily scoped the use of remote sensing technology as a component of this project yet, but it's definitely something that we can discuss with our researchers. We have some excellent work around remote sensing at Thompson Rivers University with Dr. John Church, who's the beef chair. So there's definitely the potential, and we can scope this as we move further along the lines of developing our research studies design with our farm partners.
Great. And then one last
what about
question. Yeah, the methane from cattle. Do you want to just touch on that?
Yeah, so I don't, Serena, correct me if I'm wrong, we haven't specifically discussed anything about methane to the best of my knowledge, though there is going to be a greenhouse gas or nitrogen budgeting. I don't think that methane has been incorporated into that, though. Can you speak more to that, Serena?
Yeah, I think actually on both questions, the reason why those haven't been touched on is because we have designed the project based on our producer engagement. So those two items did not come up as the highest priority of interest from our producers. So with the limited budget, we are trying to make sure that we are addressing kind of the applied contextual kind of questions that our producers have about adopting these practices and reducing any barriers to do such. And when it comes to methane, particularly, while we understand that is part of the cattle industry in general, I would say we are also looking at the vast opportunity that exists for carbon sequestration. When we're looking at beef cattle and forage production in our province, it is much more of an extensive system. In large part, we don't have a lot of feedlots. We are dealing with a lot of backgrounding, cow-calf and backgrounding operations. So I think finding and focusing on the opportunities to increase our role as a climate solution and a resilience by focusing on that soil carbon, but kind of came to the forefront from our producer perspectives.
Yeah, and that's actually a key component that I did miss when I was discussing this, is that there was some extensive engagement with producers over the fall and winter of 2021 and early winter 2022. Maybe I have that wrong, but it coincided with a couple of natural disasters, but we were able to get some really fulsome engagement with producers who really definitely narrowed in on the winter grazing and extended grazing strategies as the key areas of interest, as well as with carbon as the soil carbon as their main area of concern.
Yeah, and to note, during that process, we actually identified 4 high priorities. So we have 3 other topics of high priority that we're hoping to continue to develop to get projects underway on those fronts. So yeah, we had to choose one, and this was the top one of the 4 for the 2 commodities.
Yeah, so that's a nice point to raise for any researchers that are joining us today, or people that are looking to fund research through this engagement process. For all of the different industry partners, there were multiple BMP priorities that were identified, and then only a small number that could be supported through this project. So there's definitely opportunities to tap into that producer engagement and yeah, support further research in these other areas. Great. Well, thank you so much. I think now we're going to move on to field vegetables. And I'd like to introduce Lisa Yee from the BC Potato and Vegetable Association, and she's going to take the next part of the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Shauna. Hi, as Shauna mentioned, good morning, everybody. My name is Lisa Yee, and I'm the administrator for the BC Potato and Vegetable Growers Association. We are the primary organization for research and industry development for field vegetable growers. So we have a number of partners, one which is not listed there, but is a big part of, obviously, is AAFC. We have ES Crop working with us, and also the Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust, as we feel it's really important that they understand the growers' practices and their fields, and both organizations are quite familiar with the growers and their individual crops and their practices. So as all the other commodity groups mentioned, they did surveys. We also did surveys when we were exploring this project. with our growers, and based on the feedback, we decided to pilot 2 BMPs, and the focus is going to be for our group is nutrient management and winter cover cropping. There's a lot of talk on fertilizer management, reduction, and the 4 R's. We are basing our work on the 4 R's, meaning reduction, timing, and placement. But as this is a trial, the growers have to feel comfortable, and it is a test and demo for that. So a lot of the farmers do nutrient management, but maybe not on the precision level that we're going to test through this project. And the other one, obviously, is the winter cover cropping. And I'll speak to that a little bit more later. For year 1, for logistics, we are going to focus on Delta, the region. We did do testing, post-harvest testing on 4 potato growers operations, and that was about 60 fields in total across Lower Mainland and the Fraser Valley. And then through those tests, we recently did choose 4 sites to do the demos. So the demos will be including soil amendments, which we've chosen as compost, and in addition to nitrogen trials. So we haven't quite figured out how we're going to do the split nitrogen trials, but it's going to be like side by side, demoing their normal practices and then figuring out how we're going to work with the nitrogen split trials. So we will follow, the goal is that we follow these 4 demo sites for 4 years, and we'll be doing the nutrient budgeting as we go along. I think it's important, and we will be working with communicating with the growers a few times a year on their results for the soils and what's changing through the soil amendments and adjusting, and hopefully probably by year 3 having a more clear vision on what kind of nutrient management plan they can have moving forward. We're also sort of on the outreach part of, in greater numbers, reaching out to the growers on soil health, soil testing, and the nitrogen management. So we're sort of working in hand with what's going on in the industry as well, so that it's good timing. Back to the winter cover cropping. We're still working on that, and part of the challenge is here in Delta, we have waterfowl damage for many years, and we are often faced with shorter and wet planting seasons. So the cover cropping has to be a variety that they can get in the fields at the right time and is not eaten by the birds. So we're looking to work with the Delta Farmland Wildlife Trust, which has worked with a lot of our growers here in Delta for 20+ years, and testing new varieties potentially, and those would be on different demonstration sites. So our research questions are similar to the other groups. The economics part of it is pretty important. Cost of fertilizer and nitrogen is important. Potatoes need a lot of nitrogen. So their testing is going to be hopefully provide a good information on the costs and inputs. So we'll do high level cost benefit analysis. The farmers are, as I mentioned before, are very interested in improving their soil. Soil erosions happened in a lot of the fields, but soil health in general. So that will be monitored. And then of course their yields and quality on the nutrient budgeting, the effects of that. We'll be measuring, or AFC is going to help us with the N2O measuring, and I think that will be more on a modeling basis prediction, because given the 4 years, it's challenging to really say the impacts. Problem, I guess, with having 4 years, we have different climates, different soils, but hopefully we'll see a pattern of some results in the soil testing. So, and again, I think we're really emphasizing on showing the farmers what's going on. So field days will be important, workshops on what's the results of the split nitrogen trials, fact sheets, I guess, on the case studies as well. So we'll do multiple ways of communicating the information. And I think, and again, in the future too, we hope to say maybe in year 3, extend it to more growers. And if it's not just the nitrogen trials, the split trials, hopefully we will get more growers involved in doing that, maybe in a smaller plot. We're doing the trials, the 4 trials in about 5-acre size lots. So again, budgeting and logistics is quite, you have to think that throughout when you're doing this work, and communicating with the growers. So I think that's about all that we're at this point, but if anybody has any other questions.
Great, thank you, Lisa. There is a first question for you here, just around the cover crop varieties. And do you have a sense of some of the cover crop varieties that are of interest?
Well, it's more of the trust was working on. She was going to come up with something in a month that we could try, but legumes, I think, I don't know exactly what variety, but I think that's something, because that helps a lot with the soil, carbon soil. So I can't say specifically, but that would be the Farmland Wildlife Trust is working on that, and with UBC.
Thanks, Lisa. If there are any other field veg questions, feel free to put those in the chat. I also did see a comment in the chat that you're unable to copy from the chat, which doesn't make it hard to copy that contact information. We'll work on remedying that. But if not, I will also, in the follow-up information after the webinar, we'll share everybody's contact information, as well as a link to the recording, which was another question that came up. Yeah, so don't worry, you will have all the contact information and recording and a copy of the presentation to take away with you. And maybe I'll just, while we wait to see if there's any other field veg focused questions, I'll answer the question here around the list of BMPs that growers and commodity groups put together. So as I was mentioning in the last Q&A, there was all this producer engagement that took place, and we don't have a ready list for that, but you could definitely follow up with each of the industry groups, and they would be able to provide that for you. The engagement looked a little different for each of those associations. Some were done through surveys, some were done through meetings. So the way that they pull that information together is different. But absolutely, if you reached out to the industry lead, they will be able to share that with you. Okay, and I believe this is a question for you, Lisa. Last one before your go. Are there plans to measure soil microorganisms? Are you going to look more at quantitative soil chemistry measurement for your reporting? And this is actually kind of like a pan BC Living Lab question. But I don't know, Lisa, do you want to speak to that at all, just around what you're thinking in terms of soil health evaluation?
Well, that's a research question, but I know that AFC will help be doing the analysis. I'm not sure if they're going to go on that level because we're sort of doing the basics, and because we have to kind of watch the soil is going to change. So I don't know, again, that's something maybe would happen in year 3 or 4. I don't know, Sean, if you can add more to that, but I think right now we're looking, I think, I don't know if we'll be looking in that quite depth, but until again, we build up the soil and figure out the changes.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I think Kristen is going to pipe in here with an answer.
You bet.
Great. Kirsten, do you want to answer live?
Yeah.
Oh,
Maybe
perfect.
that would be
Wonderful.
more
I'm like, is
efficient.
she typing? Or
Sorry,
feel free to
everybody.
just come back.
Yes, so the question was about doing more in-depth soil chemistry analyses and microbial analyses. And while that is all kind of still to be finalized, we certainly will be. We've been thinking about doing some measurements of post-harvest nitrogen concentrations, for example, to help support some of the nitrogen budgeting work we're doing. We're also going to be doing some measurements of indicators of soil health, some very general ones that we're hoping to do across all commodity groups that are kind of broadly recognized indicators of soil health. But we are working with researchers both within AAFC and at the universities of British Columbia and at University of Northern British Columbia, who have expertise in using genomic tools for looking at microbial community composition and function. So different commodities are participating with different researchers within different institutions, but we're going to be working together to kind of homogenize those analyses to answer some questions that have broad applicability across the BC Living Lab, as well as to help answer some specific questions that individual commodity groups like vegetable producers have.
Thank you, Kristen. Okay, so now I'd like to move on to the perennial row crops. So as part of the BC Living Lab, we have numerous perennial row crops. There's wine grape and tree fruit in the Okanagan, and then blueberries, raspberries, and hazelnut growers in the Lower Mainland. So I'm going to pass things now to Gail Nelson from the BC Fruit Growers Association, and she's going to share with us some of the Okanagan plants.
Thank you, Shauna, and good morning, everybody. So I'm Gail Nelson. I'm the Horticulture and Research Project Manager with the BC Fruit Growers Association, one of the industry partners for the perennial row group. So within this larger group, we have wine grape, tree fruits, also our berries and hazelnut. The wine grape and tree fruit activities will mainly be concentrated in the Okanagan, and for berries and hazelnut, their activities will mainly be concentrated in the Lower Mainland. Collectively, we will be supported by our scientists from the University of BC. For our region, it's UBCO. We'll also be supported to a large extent by our scientists at AFC, Summerland Research and Development Center, and also Shabtai, who is in AFC Agassiz as well. The focus for tree fruit is really inter-row cover cropping. There is some interest in in-row cover cropping as well, but generally we'll be looking at cover cropping in our drive rows. Like other commodities, we arrived at this BMP as our focus BMP through consultations with our growers as well as our research committee. What we noticed was that cover cropping was an area that it showed the greatest commonality in terms of interest across all of our perennial row crops. It also, though it was not necessarily top of mind when we were doing our consultations with our growers, it was definitely an area of interest, but it also provides, or the advantage is that application of cover crops also provides some of the on-farm benefits or co-benefits, as we call them, that growers are really interested in. And here we're talking about things like our nitrogen and irrigation management, building our soil organic carbon, and also, improving our soil health generally. Another area that is of interest to our growers is improving crop performance. Another thing to note is that although there's not a lot of work as it regards cover cropping in tree fruits, I suppose we can make a general statement that, to say that generally the drive row or drive row vegetation is unmanaged, particularly in our conventional farms. There is some work that is being done by our organic farmers in this regard, but in terms of scale, it's not a wide scale practice to manage our vegetation in our drive rows. And with that being said, in terms of the options that are available to growers for, cover crop species, we've been lucky in that we have gotten a lot of support from our AFC scientists in terms of coming up with a broad list. And generally, when we talk about our cover cropping species, we're talking about our grasses and cereals, or legumes. We're also looking at our brassicas and other broadleaf species. through our consultations, both at the start of the program, so let's say over the past year, one of the key messages or one of the key takeaways for us is that growers, although they're interested, they really need more information in terms of what cover crops are appropriate to our own local context. And they have, identified some crop management practices or associated crop management practices that they would be interested in trying out. So in terms of options for our treatments, we're looking at the possibility of either modifying or naturally occurring ground vegetation or manipulating, the existing ground vegetation. And in that regard, we're looking at potential application of solid stands of one plant species, or perennials or winter annuals or summer annuals, depending on what the particular priorities of that producer, collaborator, depending on what their priority is. We are also looking at, and I think, the best practice, certainly from a risk management point of view, is having a mixture of these plant species. Ultimately, the grower is the one who is going to make the final decision as to which cover crops they'll be selecting for their orchard and which crop management practice they'll also be utilizing. However, they will be fully supported by our scientific community, and to the extent that we can provide information or other support, the BCFGA and other industry associations will also support that decision making. The research questions, like the other commodities, really surround the economics of practices. So, whether you're looking at your mow and blow, whether you're looking at, reduced fertilization, the timing of your mowing or termination, whether you're looking at no-till drill seeding, what are some of the costs and benefits that are associated with that practice? And further, what are some of the barriers to adopting that particular practice? And what are some of the, what are some of the incentives to adopting that practice? So we hope to do that work over the course of the 5 years of the project. Like the other commodities or similar to field vegetables, we'll also be looking at changes in soil organic carbon. We'll also be looking at our nitrous oxide emissions, and also our soil health and other co-benefits. And to the question that was asked earlier about whether we'll be looking at soil biology as a component of soil health, that will definitely be a focus for tree fruits. Next slide, please. So in terms of our near-term tree fruit research plans, we have had a major grower engagement in January of this year. And it was really bringing growers together who, through our previous survey and other interactions, expressed an interest in trialing BMPs. And what we wanted to do was to identify our current practices and use the opportunity to get feedback and facilitate the co-development of these BMPs. One of the next steps for us is to have one-on-ones with growers who have indicated their interest to identify what their specific priorities are as it relates to adoption of, cover cropping. Are you looking at weed suppression? Are you looking at water management? What are your particular needs? And then we'll be developing our individual BMP trial plans based on those further consultations. For the first year, or for this year, we want to identify 2 to 3 primary research sites, which this is where our intensive monitoring will take place. Our year 1 and year 5 monitoring will take place, looking at our soil organic concentration, carbon concentrations, or nitrous oxide measurements, or nutrient budgeting as appropriate. We'll also be assessing the prioritized co-benefits. And in the near term too, we will also be starting our socioeconomic analysis. So we'll be collecting baseline information in the next few weeks, you know, and starting to really get the profile of, you know, what are some of the incentives and barriers to adopting these BMPs. We also, like other commodities, want to establish satellite sites for observational purposes, or, you know, not necessarily in the first year, but we want to build out from these primary sites in terms of identifying other sites where the monitoring may not be as intensive, but we can still provide, you know, get very important information from them. I should say that in terms of our primary research sites, we want to at least have, you know, we're looking at least having one apple and one cherry orchard, and we're making those decisions in terms of the final site identifications as we speak. As it regards knowledge transfer and extension plans, so we had our kickoff meeting earlier this year. We want to have our one-on-ones, you know, continue with growth consultations in terms of trial design and over the life of the project, where adjustments may need to be made based on results. And you know, as we said, the producer has a lot to say in terms of how their trials go, both in terms of establishment and maintenance over the 5 years. So having those consultations will be very important. In terms of informational resources, we'll be developing fact sheets and guides. In terms of, you know, our in-person engagements or our broader engagements, with not just growers that are involved in the BMP, but our broader grower base. We'll be having, you know, field days on our trial sites, annual workshops, and where opportunities permit, we will also have our presentation at tree fruit horticultural events. So I think I've said a mouthful. I will leave some time for Hans to speak about the work that's been done in wine grape, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you, Gail. We will have a pause for Q&A after the wine grape portion of this presentation. So now I'll pass things over to Hans Buchler from the BC Wine Grape Council to talk about some of the specifics of the wine grape part of this project.
Well, thanks very much, Shauna and Gail. You covered a lot, so I might be a little bit shorter than that. Just a little bit of background for me. I am an organic wine grape grower in the south end of the Okanagan Valley. I've been growing grapes for, well, it is 4 decades now. So I've been around for a while. And, you know, from the grape side, I think there has been interest in cover cropping for a while. I would say for the last 2 decades. We had, I mean, he's still the entomologist at the Summerland Research and Development Center, Dr. Lowry. He developed quite a lot of interest in cover crops in terms of their impact on the diversity of insect populations in the grape environment. And I think there are quite a few of us growers who have kind of trialed a number of different cover crops over the years. So we are both interested in inter and in-row cover crops. I mean, other people call it alleyway and undervine cover crops. And that there is maybe a little bit more interest in undervine cover crops in the grapes than in the tree fruit. It's an interesting challenge that is not easy to meet. I mean, most people do either mechanically or with a herbicide keep the strip undervine relatively vegetation free in order to reduce competition. And you know, any cover crop you add to that, you want to be really, really careful that it is not going to compete with your main crop. So I mean, in that choice of cover crops, we have developed a list of more than 40 cover crops that we are interested in. A lot of them are legumes, but also grasses and some forms, radishes as well were mentioned. But I mean, what the grower in the end chooses really to grow really depends on what the objective is of growing cover crop. And that there are multiple, you know, organic matter, probably everybody is interested in increasing organic matter in the soil. some farmers are interested in substituting synthetic nitrogen with legume cover crops. Some cover crops can be used as biofumigants. I mean, these are mostly Nebraska area. Very broad interest in increasing biodiversity in the environment through establishing cover crops that also serve as feed sources for a lot of very small organisms. And some of our growers are even interested now in growing a secondary cash crop between the rows, and some are looking at growing lentils, others are looking at growing chickpeas in between the vine rows. And I'm kind of really interested to see how this pans out, because at this you could possibly kill two birds in one with this. You could still increase your organic matter in the soil and possibly contribute a little bit of nitrogen while also taking another crop off. So I mentioned legumes for nitrogen contribution, either substitution or possibly, possibly entire replacement of synthetic inputs there. The brassicas as biofumigants, they possibly might work as for a weed suppression. They might inhibit germination of weeds. And they were looking mostly at mustards, white, brown, and black mustards. Then there are other species with allelopathic effects, and very popular is the fall rye. I mean, that's practiced quite broadly already in the wine grape field. Tillage radish, daikon radish, I mean, these were mentioned earlier for kind of loosening up the soil, sort of alleviating soil compaction, and there's very broad interest in this as well. Soil compaction is a real serious problem in crops where traffic with equipment is quite intense, and I mean, that is the case in most perennial row crops. Diversity of flowering plants for the biodiversity, but also really for beneficial organisms as a food source and attracting pollinators. And we're very interested in trialing cover crops that will also work under drip irrigation, where there is not an overhead or a micro sprinkler type of irrigation that covers the entire area. And this is going to be a huge challenge, but we are always happy to meet the challenge at all. The next one, please. In terms of research questions, I mean, the soil health, a number of people talked about already, and we have especially intense interest in the soil organism side of soil health. I mean, it's a fascinating field where we know very little so far. I mean, we can sort of identify groups of soil organisms, mostly in relation to their function. And collecting more knowledge there will take a long time, but I think that has a huge potential in the long run. And that, of course, with the increased organic matter in the soil, you also increase your water holding capacity, increase your crop's resilience to drought, and that is really critical in areas like the South Okanagan it's already a semi-arid environment with, on occasion, in some years, limited amount of water supply, so very critical to remedy this to some degree. The impact on crop health and quality, I mean, we have sort of had some incidental experience in the past that cover crops might help in suppressing fungal diseases, and we hope to do some more precise work on this, and maybe be able to collect some data to see whether this is really true or whether this is coincidental. Again, the impact on the returns, the benefit cost analysis, certainly also important. Carbon sequestration, I mean, this is in some of the soils where we're growing wine grapes that are very coarse. This is a big challenge because there's there's a limit of how much carbon you can sequester in the long term. I mean, you can add a lot of organic matter, but it will decompose very quickly and will not really become part of the permanent or semi-permanent carbon bank in the soil. So but we do work on a very large variety of soils, and some soils might lend themselves better for a long-term carbon storage than others. And with greenhouse gas emissions with the nitrous oxide, we're really interested to find out whether nitrogen provided by cover crops, legume cover crops, what their contribution might be to nitrous oxide emission, whether it is similar to the synthetic form of nitrogen, or whether there is a substantial reduction in N2O emissions. And then, of course, the impact on water management. Typically, if you grow cover crops, you require more water. But with using more water, you also create more carbon that you can, in many soils, sequester in the longer term. And we are really, what we are in the long term aiming for is a system that requires very small amount of input in terms of energy, carbon input from all the fossil fuels we're burning these days with equipment. That then balances where the benefits do exceed the cost on the carbon side, but also on the energy side and the overall environmental emission side. And I think we have another slide after that, Shauna. Okay, the research plans, we intend to establish 3 or 4 primary sites, and we have very, very broad interest from industry in participating. So we will probably have to refuse a few people. Initially, we planned to establish 10 or more satellite sites. By now, we're probably at 15. And on these, the main interest on these will be to trial a variety of different cover crop species to see how they do on various soils and various geographies throughout the valley, but also on how well they do under different irrigation systems and approaches. Because typically the wine grapes for a large portion of the season are irrigated. We call it regulated deficit irrigation, where we actually irrigate less than what the evapotranspiration of the plant would be. So the plant is always a little bit starved for moisture. And we might have the ability to add a few more sites over the years. We have a budget for seeds, but this is basically the only support that we have for growers. All the work and related expenses are up to the participating growers. But I think many are quite happy to do this. So knowledge transfer is going to be critical in the long term in this, if we do want to become the approach that we're taking to growing cover crops in vineyards. If we want this to become the common practice, we do have a lot of work to demonstrate, for one thing, that it works and how well it works, and that also it does not add to the cost of production. And all these are things that are going to be fairly critical to demonstrate. And for this, we always organize a lot of field days where we go and visit the farms. We're doing trials, fact sheets. YouTube videos are becoming very popular for some, and we do organize a lot of webinars as well in the grape and the wine sector for growers that then also get posted on our website. So, and that is pretty much it. There was early on there was the question on the Cherry Growers Association, and we did actually in the early days when we started developing the program, we did contact the Cherry Growers Association repeatedly, but they unfortunately never became really actively involved in the program development. So eventually, I think we probably did forget about them, and if that was a mistake, I apologize for that. Anyway, that would be it for me.
Great, thank you both, Gail and Hans. So here's a chance now for questions for Tree Fruit and Wine Grape, and then we'll have our final part of the presentation, which will be about berries and hazelnut. I know there were a couple questions about whether those groups were involved. Absolutely. So question for you, Hans, around your cover crop list. And I think you're still working on defining those species, but there is, or varieties, but there is a question around whether or not you have a short list already, and if that could be made available.
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, with the list we have right now is composed of more than 40 different cover crop species. And some of these are relatively common, like red clovers, white clovers, and vetches, etc. And others are, in the legume side, are species that we have really not tried around here. Some are newly developed species. One is a balanza clover that is apparently somewhat winter hardy around here. Quite interested in trying this. And there are some others that are used fairly, to some degree, I would say, in California as well, might have some winter hardiness, because this is sort of the critical difference between our area and what can be done in the more southern US is really how well the cover crop makes it through the winter. And if you want to establish something that stays there for an extended period of time, winter hardiness is pretty critical. And there are some others in the legumes too that we're in. I mean, the bird's foot trefoil is an example that we have tried, and it works on some soils quite well, but there are many different cultivars there that we might want to try out. Something called sainfoin, or esparcette in Europe, both in German and French language, is also a legume that is used. It grows even in northern BC, is in some areas used instead of alfalfa. And it's probably, for anyone who also has livestock, is one of the most interesting legume cover crops. It's one of the best legumes for livestock because it's non-bloating and has very high nutritional value, makes very good milk. So another secondary cash crop would be livestock, I guess, then in vineyards. And
yeah.
a neighbor of mine actually does graze Scottish Highland cattle in the fall and winter in his vineyard. It's a great idea.
Thanks, Hans, for going into some detail there. And I think this is one of the things that will be coming out from this project, from each segment of it, is, you know, more details around the crops and varieties that were considered, what was chosen and why, and then, you know, how the ones that were trialed were working. So there also are, both of the next questions are focused on this question around cover crop use and the relation with nitrogen fertilizer. So I think Hans and Gail, maybe you both want to answer this one. So in your projects, are you looking at both cover cropping and how that might be tied to a reduction in the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer? Obviously, if there can be a reduction in synthetic fertilizer use, that would be an economic benefit for farmers. So do you want to just each speak to that and how that might be playing out and might be evaluated in your projects?
Yeah, nitrogen budgeting will be definitely a part of this. I mean, we will measure the amount of nitrogen contributed by the cover crops, and that thereby also make some conclusions on to what degree we are able to actually substitute other nitrogen inputs. And in grapes require a relatively small amount of nitrogen. In grapes, it's fairly easy to substitute the nitrogen contributed by legumes with a. In other crops, it's really there is a question of management practice. If you want to provide very high amounts of nitrogen, in general, you're changing your practice a little bit. You're probably reseeding your legume crop every year. You're also inoculating your legume crop, which sort of optimizes the amount of nitrogen that is being fixed in the root nodules of the plant. And then you terminate your cover crop when it is going to into bloom. This is when the maximum of nitrogen is actually in the plant. If you let it go to seed after that, the plant actually absorbs a fair bit of the nitrogen it has produced already for the production of a seed. So it will, if you will require very high nitrogen from your cover crop, it will affect how you're managing your cover crop, and it will become a bit more of an intensive management.
Yeah, and
So,
Gail, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, I'll just say ditto to most of Hans's points, except that he mentioned the nitrogen, the needs for grape. It's different from tree fruit, so you would require higher nitrogen concentrations. But generally, yes, it is an area of interest for us, and the information in terms of the potential to reduce nitrogen inputs, it's part of the nutrient budgeting exercise. Again, as that mentioned earlier, we will be having these additional consultations with our growers, because there might be specific priorities for a particular site as opposed to another site. But generally speaking, yeah, nitrogen, the reduction or the replacement of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers is definitely an area of interest for us in tree fruit.
Great, thanks, Gail and Hans. There is one question left in the Q&A, but it relates to fertigation, which is a perfect segue to the Lower Mainland Perennial Row Crop Project. So I'm going to now pass things to Zach Fleming from the BC Hazelnut Growers Association, who's working with Eric Gerbrandt, who represents the BC Blueberry Association and the Raspberry Industry Council, and they're working on the Perennial Row Crop Lower Mainland project. So yeah, Zach, I'll pass things to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Shauna. It's great to be here presenting on behalf of the berries and hazelnuts. Eric couldn't be here today, so I'll do my best to answer as many berry questions as well as hazelnuts, but maybe don't quote me on everything there. So like Shauna mentioned, the partners for our side of the project is the BC Blueberry Council, the Raspberry Industry Development Council, BC Hazelnut Growers Association, and we'll be working primarily with the University of BC with Sean Smuckler, Thorsten Kniffer, and Simone Catalerano, I believe. Hopefully I got those names correct. And like what was mentioned earlier is we originally started as one large perennial row crop grew with the interior grapes and tree fruit. And then we've essentially broken it up into regional base. We found that was a little bit more constructive for research and for budgeting purposes. So all of our research is really going to be happening in the Fraser Valley. That's kind of where we're going to be focusing. And we kind of have the two target BMPs, the first one being cover crops, and the second one being precision irrigation and nutrient management. So for cover cropping, we're looking at a couple of different kind of treatments and ideas. Again, this is a berry and hazelnut, and even within berries, there's blueberry and raspberries. So there's already quite a lot of different management practices and important elements to these different crops. So we're doing our best to try to find something that's common between them that we can actually dig in deeper on some of these BMPs. So the general idea on cover cropping is to do bare ground control, which is still a primary production method for berry crops in the Fraser Valley. I believe still over 50% of producers still don't have any covers between their rows. So that's kind of where we're starting with our control. Then from there, going to more a grower standard perennial mix. Usually it's a rye or fescue mix. And then our idea is looking at, okay, what are some other potential cover crop ideas? So it's been mentioned in here with a lot of the other groups doing cover cropping is looking at potentially legumes, both for just, soil improvement as well as for nitrogen fixing. However, we're still at the starting phase of trying to figure out with our growers, what kind of cover crops are going to make sense, what's worth trialing to actually be able to bring an improvement to what's being currently used beyond the standard, just perennial fescue mixes. And then in addition to that, we really wanted to look at more of the nitrogen side. So how does precision irrigation, so the use of drip irrigation within our rows in combination with our nitrogen management, so using fertigation, how can we bring that whole aspect in it to improve our nitrogen usage and our nitrogen uptake, ultimately reducing our nitrogen gas emissions. So this will be done kind of in combination with our cover cropping. So we'll have different slightly different setups and blocks depending on the crops and the areas. And again, like most other of the groups, again, you're just hearing it over and over again. Some of our research questions is the economics. So really that's always the bottom line. Are these BMPs, one, going to make an improvement to the environment, but two, are they actually economical for producers to take on? And then with that, we're going to look at mitigation. So are we increasing our soil organic carbon? Are we reducing our nitrous oxide emissions? Both key components to the Living Labs project and to our producers as we continue looking at climate change. And ultimately, there's other soil health benefits, co-benefits, looking at improved water retention in the soil, ultimately yields, and the factors around pest management are very important to us. So we're hoping to bring some of those elements into our research. Then going on, next slide. So yeah, research plans. So we're both berries and hazelnuts. We're currently in the prep stages for getting trial sites figured out and some of the project details. So we're looking at between 4 to 5 demonstration sites per commodity. So that's going to be blueberries, that's going to be raspberries, that's going to be hazelnuts. Realistically, it's probably all going to happen within the Lower Mainland, kind of where the most berries and hazelnuts are produced. My guess is between Chilliwack to Langley. A lot of this comes down to budget constraints and just visiting multiple sites and having our research kind of condensed. But again, like other projects, we hope that over time, this is going to be an ongoing developing project that we can eventually reach out and expand to more groups and more areas. And yeah, we're going to be doing a couple different design ideas. A lot of it's going to be a comparison. So we're going to have, a control right beside 2 different kind of cover crops. We'll probably do a bit of a split plot design where we'll actually have irrigation and nitrogen built within those kind of research blocks to kind of get 2 birds with 1 stone. And the goal of this always is to deal with our producers. So like I said, we're going to be reaching out over the next couple of weeks here, reaching out to both the berry communities, the hazelnut communities, bringing producers on, trying to find which sites are going to kind of meet our requirements, and working with UBC on what those are going to look like. And then ultimately, the KTT component is huge. This is something we are already pretty active in, and we're just going to essentially become more active in. So really looking at field days, so going on to site, looking at what these growers are doing, how are these BMPs actually affecting their production. So field days is a big component, as well as working on workshops, specifically at the end of the project when we actually have some findings to report over these 4 to 5 years. This is long-term research. So this is going to be a slow build and a slow ramp up as we get more information, as we see more benefits coming from these trials. So I always tell people, bear with us, be patient. This is going to be something that's going to keep developing and hopefully have some improvement over time. And that's kind of it. So if there's questions, feel free to send them at me.
Great, thanks so much, Zach. All right, so I know we've thrown a lot at you, everybody. Thanks for hanging in there. We do have a couple questions for Zach. So the first question is hazelnut specific. So how do you plan to reach out to growers that are beyond the membership of the BC Hazelnut Growers Association? How can other farmers get involved? I think you have some keen people on the call today.
Yeah, I do. I love it. Haley and Tom, there's some great components to our industry. Yeah, so we'll be reaching out through our membership. I mean, we have newsletters beyond our membership as well. And then working with other strategic partners, some of the other processors, nurseries, who sell hazelnut trees, just to get the word out to potential growers. And then my guess is we'll probably have some kind of meeting in the next couple of weeks, a Zoom meeting to work with collaborators, kind of see, who's available, what kind of requirements, what kind of options we have with land and availability, and again, excitement from the producers to actually do these trials now that we kind of know what we're working on. So what does that look like on farm and getting some buy-in there?
Great, thanks for that. And then there's a question around getting the BC HASCAP growers involved. I feel like that's maybe more of an Eric Gerbrandt question, as he is big fan of HASCAP.
Yep.
So I think, unless you want to speak to that, Zach, I could probably just say that, that if there are opportunities to involve the HASCAP industry, I think you guys would be all for it. I will note though, I mean, we do have 9 commodities in this BC Living Lab. So, and in the perennial row crops, they have 5 different commodities. So it already has been pretty challenging, as you can imagine, bringing all these different groups together. But as things go on, definitely if there are opportunities and if the BMPs can be somewhat similar, I think that's something that could be added on. Zach, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's really it. I know in the beginning stages, we kind of reached out to a bunch of different perennial groups. This is, already a couple of years back now, when we initially established our perennial group, and, refining it down, getting to a kind of a core team is how I'd say it right now. Okay, there's enough commonality, research that's lining up so that we can actually move these projects forward. We'd love to connect, and the goal is that this is a perennial row crop. So hopefully the information from, our 5 commodities can slowly translate to other perennial row crop commodities out there, like HASCAP. So that's kind of the ultimate goal, is that this is more than just our 5 commodities. This is, BC perennial growers, again, across BC.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, I'm just going to put a plug in there for anyone that wants to ask a question of any of our speakers today. Here's a great chance to have your last opportunity to tap something into the Q&A there. If you are directing it to someone who spoke previously, it would be really helpful if you could put their name or maybe the production type, then we can make sure we direct it to the right person. But Zach, I do want to ask you one last question. There was a question that came up around evaluating different types of organic fertigation techniques versus targeted row spraying methods, and using substitutes, like different types of nitrogen fertilizers, so like compost tea or fish meal blends, and what the best equipment or techniques might be. So is that something that is part of what you'll be evaluating in your project?
Yeah, so like I kind of mentioned, we haven't fully defined the scope of the actual treatments and trials yet. So that's something we'll be doing again over the next month or so. So it's definitely a component that will be discussed. It's going to kind of come down to what's feasible, what are our growers looking for? Is this high on their radar? Is this something they're interested in? If it is, it's something we'll definitely, pursue. However, I have a feeling that most of the producers we're working with are in the conventional sphere of things. So that might be where we start with. However, like I said, this is a long program, so things can change, and especially with pricing changing and opportunities changing, I definitely see that this is a potential for future trials.
Great. And one last question for you. Will there be a guide produced at the end of your project to help all those perennial row crop producers adopt these practices?
I'm not 100% sure. I'm pretty sure there'll be something like that. Again, our KTT will be hopefully expansive with both fact sheets, field trials, webinars, whatever we can do to help increase BMP uptake. That's a huge important aspect to us and the researchers for this program. So if it is something that is, or could use a fact sheet or a production guide aspect, I know there is the berry production guide and the hazelnut production guide. So this might be a component that gets added to those that already exist, and maybe not a separate component.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That's all the questions we have in our Q&A. And I see that you put your contact information in the chat, which is great. Okay, so, well, I want to say thank you to all of our speakers today, as well as everyone that joined the webinar. Just a couple of wrap up. So as I mentioned before, we will share out the recording of the presentation. We can share out a copy of the presentation, as well as the contacts for all of the project leads. And we will share a copy of the chat as well. So, as I said, this is our first chance to do a public presentation, but there's so much more to come in this project. And I know there was some shock around that year 1 is ending March 31st. Just on that point, really the official agreements for this project didn't take place until the fall. And so, we are starting behind, but, we're ready to hit the ground running. So for people that want to find out more information or stay in the loop of what's going on with the project, you can check out the project website. You can sign up there for an e-news that will go out regularly. Feel free to reach out to me as one of the BC Living Lab coordinators, or of course any of the industry leads if you have a specific interest in one of those projects. And then lastly, I just wanted to also recognize that, of course, the funding for the BC Living Lab project is coming from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada through the Agricultural Climate Solutions Living Labs program. And that this BC Living Lab project is truly a partnership between so many partners, and it is industry-led, and the Investment Agriculture Foundation has been sort of the hub bringing together all these different producer associations together in this project. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And yeah, feel free to follow up with additional questions. And yeah, we'll look forward to see more engagement as the project continues.